I knew something was off the moment I pulled into my driveway. My camper, my fully legal, properly registered camper, was gone. Vanished. I threw the truck into park and stepped out, heart hammering with a mix of anger and confusion. That's when I saw her. Francine Reynolds, the self-proclaimed president of the Oakridge Estates HOA, was standing across the street, arms folded, lips pursed in that smug way that made my blood pressure spike. She was flanked by two other HOA cronies, both looking far too pleased with themselves. "Looking for something, Nathan?" she called out, all fake sweetness. I clenched my jaw. "Where's my camper, Francine?" "Oh, that." She gave a theatrical little sigh. "It was towed. Violating HOA policy. You can't park recreational vehicles in the driveway for more than 24 hours. I took a slow breath, forcing myself to keep my voice level. I read the bylaws when I moved in. That rule only applies to unregistered vehicles or those left for more than 72 hours. My camper was there for exactly 1 day. Francine's smile widened. "We had a board meeting last night and voted to amend the rule. It now states 24 hours. You should have been more proactive about checking for updates." I stared at her. "You can't just change rules overnight and enforce them retroactively." "Oh, but we can." She pulled out a printed document. "It's all here. And as HOA president, I have full authority to ensure compliance." I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. These people had no idea who they were messing with. I was a state trooper. And the towing company they had likely used? They reported to the state licensing board, a board I had direct influence over. Francine had just picked a fight she couldn't win. But before I played my trump card, I needed proof. "You've just made a big mistake, Francine," I said, my voice dangerously calm. She laughed. "Oh, Nathan, you can fight this all you want, but the camper's gone, and you'll have to pay a hefty fee to get it back. Plus, next time, it'll be an even bigger fine." I didn't respond. I just turned on my heel and walked into my house. She thought she had power? She was about to find out what real power looked like. I didn't waste a second. The first thing I did was pull up the towing laws for the state. I already knew them by heart, but I wanted everything in front of me, word for word. Then I checked my security camera footage. Sure enough, at precisely 3 in the morning, a tow truck had pulled up, hooked onto my camper, and hauled it away. That alone was illegal. State law required a 72-hour notice before an HOA could tow a vehicle from private property. They also needed to provide the owner with written documentation of the violation beforehand. Francine and her little group had skipped all of that. They had just committed grand theft auto. I dialed the number for my contact at the state towing board. When he answered, I kept my tone professional but firm. I explained the situation, sent over the footage, and gave him the name of the HOA. He promised to look into it immediately. Next, I called the towing company directly. I didn't mention I was law enforcement just yet. I wanted to see if they would admit to the violation on their own. The dispatcher answered. I asked about my camper and she put me on hold. A few minutes later, a gruff voice came on the line. "The owner." He told me my camper had been towed at the request of the Oakridge Estates HOA. When I asked for a copy of the tow authorization and the required 72-hour notice, there was a long pause. Then he cleared his throat and said the HOA had assured them everything was in order. I pressed him. He got defensive. That was all I needed. I ended the call and immediately contacted the local police department. I wasn't filing this through my agency. I wanted it handled by an outside jurisdiction to avoid any potential conflicts. I sent them the footage, the towing laws, and my formal complaint. By the time I was done, I had a case number and confirmation that an officer would be dispatched to the towing lot. Now it was time to deal with Francine. I walked outside. She was still out there, chatting with one of her cronies. When she saw me approaching, she put on that same fake pleasant expression. I didn't give her a chance to speak. "You had my camper towed illegally. State law requires 72 hours notice and a written warning before removal. You provided neither." She barely blinked. "The HOA has the right to enforce its rules as necessary." I stepped closer. "You committed grand theft auto." That got her attention. A flicker of uncertainty crossed her face before she masked it with indifference. "That's absurd. The HOA has the authority." "No," I cut her off. "The HOA does not override state law, and I have already reported the towing company. They are now under investigation for an illegal tow." That made her flinch. "You can try to weasel your way out of this," I continued, "but the law is not on your side. My camper was taken without due process. That makes you personally liable. Her cronies exchanged nervous glances. Francine straightened her spine. You'll have to take that up with the board. I already have the police involved. I let that sink in. And if my camper isn't returned in the next 2 hours, every single board member who approved this is looking at legal repercussions. Her face had lost all its smugness now. She opened her mouth, then closed it. Without another word, she turned and walked briskly back to her house. I didn't move. I just watched her retreat, knowing full well she was scrambling for a way out of this mess. But there was no way out. She had crossed the wrong person. Francine had underestimated me, and now she was scrambling. I could see it in the way she marched up her driveway, her posture stiff with barely contained frustration. Her little power trip had backfired spectacularly, and she knew it. I didn't wait for her to make the next move. I had more work to do. I went inside and pulled up the HOA's bylaws. I had already studied them before moving in, but now I combed through every line, looking for anything that could be used against them. A few minutes in, I found something interesting, a clause that required all changes to community regulations to be submitted to the county registry before they could be enforced. I checked the county's public records database. There was no mention of any recent rule changes from Oakridge Estates. That meant the so-called amendment Francine had cited was completely invalid. That was strike two. I called my contact at the state towing board again, who had already begun reviewing the HOA's history. He wasn't surprised when I told him they had failed to properly register their bylaw amendments. In fact, as soon as he started digging, he found multiple complaints from previous residents. Allegations of unauthorized fines, selective enforcement, and even a few cases of suspicious liens placed on homes. This wasn't just about my camper anymore. This HOA had been pulling shady dealings for years. While I was on the phone, I got a call from the towing company. The owner, who had been defensive earlier, now sounded a lot more cooperative. He admitted that his driver had been given verbal authorization from the HOA, but that no paperwork had ever been provided. That was a major violation of state law. I pressed him further, and he caved completely. He agreed to return my camper immediately at no charge. He also promised to provide a written statement confirming that the HOA had misled them. That was strike three. With everything I needed in place, I walked outside just as a tow truck pulled up, my camper hitched to the back. The driver unhooked it quickly, avoiding eye contact. I inspected everything, making sure no damage had been done. Satisfied, I turned back to see Francine standing on her porch, arms crossed tightly. I didn't call out to her. I didn't need to. She was already watching, and she knew she had lost this round. But I wasn't done yet. I spent the next few hours gathering every piece of evidence. I had the security footage, the phone records, the towing company's statement, and the county records proving the HOA's failure to register rule changes. Then I took a trip down to the county office to file an official complaint. By the time I got back, something interesting had happened. A few of my neighbors had gathered near my driveway, murmuring among themselves. Word had spread fast. One of them, a man named Greg, walked up to me. He was a retired firefighter and had lived in the neighborhood for over a decade. He wasted no time getting to the point. "We heard what happened," he said. "This isn't the first time Francine's pulled something like this. But you are the first person who's fought back this hard." I nodded. "She's been running this HOA like a personal kingdom. That ends now." Greg exhaled sharply. "You've got support. A lot of us are fed up with her nonsense. If you need statements, signatures, whatever, you've got it." That was exactly what I'd been hoping for. With the neighbors on my side, we had enough leverage to call for a special meeting, a legal requirement if enough homeowners petitioned for one. And at that meeting, we could do more than just confront Francine. We could remove her entirely. I spent the rest of the evening coordinating with Greg and several other homeowners. We drafted a formal petition to present at the next board meeting, citing violations of state law, misuse of funds, and failure to follow proper procedures. By the time the meeting rolled around a few days later, we had gathered more than enough support. Francine walked into the community center expecting business as usual. Instead, she found herself staring down a room full of angry homeowners, all armed with documentation of her misdeeds. I let Greg take the lead, letting the community voice their grievances. But when Francine tried to dismiss everything as misunderstandings, I stepped forward. I laid out the legal violations in clear, indisputable terms. I presented the towing company's statement, proving she had authorized an illegal tow. I revealed the county records showing she had never properly filed rule amendments. And finally, I read aloud the formal complaint I had submitted to the county and state authorities. By the time I was done, even her most loyal supporters were shifting in their seats uncomfortably. She tried to argue, but it was useless. The vote was called. In a landslide decision, Francine was removed as HOA president. And just like that, her reign was over. Francine's removal sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. The HOA board, now leaderless and scrambling, tried to regain control, but the damage was done. The homeowners who had lived under Francine's iron grip for years were fed up. And with her gone, they weren't about to let another power-hungry figure take over. The fallout was immediate. The remaining board members, realizing they were next on the chopping block, started resigning one by one. By the end of the week, only one board member remained, a man named Robert, who had never been a fan of Francine's tactics in the first place. He was the only one who voted against the illegal towing and had been largely sidelined by Francine's clique. With the HOA in complete disarray, the county officials I had contacted began their own investigation. They sent auditors to review the HOA's financial records, something that had never been done before. What they found was worse than I expected. There were thousands of dollars in unexplained expenses, misallocated funds, and even a few questionable contractor payments that had gone straight into accounts linked to Francine's closest allies. The county didn't waste time. They froze the HOA's accounts and issued subpoenas for financial records. Francine, despite her removal, was now facing potential legal consequences for mismanagement of funds and fraud. But I wasn't done yet. With the HOA effectively dismantled, Greg and I led an effort to restructure the community's governance. This wasn't just about getting rid of corrupt leadership, it was about making sure something like this never happened again. We worked with a real estate attorney to draft new bylaws that would prevent unchecked power, require full transparency of financial decisions, and ensure that any future rule changes had to be approved by a majority vote from homeowners. The first town hall meeting under the new structure was packed. For the first time in years, people actually felt like they had a voice. Homeowners stepped up to share their experiences, stories of fines issued without reason, letters threatening liens over minor infractions, and intimidation tactics used to keep people compliant. It was clear that the community had been living in fear of the HOA for years, and now that fear had turned into determination. The most satisfying moment came when the towing company owner, now under investigation himself, showed up at our meeting, practically begging for forgiveness. His business was on the verge of losing its license, all because he had blindly followed Francine's orders. He tried to claim ignorance, but no one was buying it. Greg spoke on behalf of the homeowners and made it clear the community would no longer do business with any company that didn't operate within the law. The owner left the meeting looking like a man who knew he had lost everything. As for Francine, her troubles were only beginning. The county investigation uncovered even more misdeeds, including unauthorized use of HOA funds for personal expenses. She had been using community money to pay for landscaping on her private property, luxury hotel stays for HOA conferences that never happened, and even personal legal fees from past disputes. The moment the official charges were filed, the neighborhood erupted in celebration. People who had once avoided speaking up were now openly discussing how they had been bullied into compliance. It was as if a weight had been lifted off the entire community. With Francine out of the picture and the HOA restructured, the neighborhood finally felt like a place people wanted to live in again. The oppressive atmosphere that had lingered for years was gone. Homeowners started organizing community events, something Francine had always shut down because they weren't in line with HOA standards. The best part? My camper was right back in my driveway, exactly where it was legally allowed to be. And this time, no one dared to say a word about it. The transformation of Oakridge Estates was rapid. With Francine gone and the HOA's power gutted, the community finally felt like a place where people wanted to live rather than a neighborhood under siege. People who had once avoided speaking to their neighbors out of fear of getting reported were now gathering outside, chatting freely, planning events, and taking back control of their homes. The suffocating grip of the HOA had been broken, and there was no going back. Despite the positive change, I knew there was still unfinished business. The county's investigation into the HOA's finances was ongoing, and the deeper they dug, the worse things got. What had started as a probe into improper rule enforcement had now turned into a full-blown fraud case. Auditors uncovered years of financial mismanagement, including missing dues, falsified expense reports, and fabricated invoices for services that had never actually been provided. It wasn't just Francine who was in trouble anymore. Several of her closest allies on the board were now being investigated, and subpoenas had been issued for personal bank records. The county prosecutor was preparing charges, and the HOA's former leadership was scrambling to cover their tracks. But there was no escape. The evidence was overwhelming. Meanwhile, the towing company that had taken my camper without proper authorization was in freefall. The report I had filed with the state towing board had triggered a full compliance review, and it turned out my incident wasn't the only illegal tow they had performed. Over the years, they had conducted dozens of unauthorized removals, many of them at HOA requests that never followed proper legal channels. The state board didn't take kindly to that. The company's license was suspended pending a formal hearing, and the owner was facing heavy fines. Without a license, he couldn't operate, and with his reputation in shambles, no one was about to vouch for him. His business was crumbling, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. While all of this was unfolding, the newly formed HOA leadership, composed of homeowners who actually cared about the community, began implementing the reforms we had drafted. Transparency was now mandatory. Financial records were open to all residents. Rule changes had to go through a democratic process rather than being arbitrarily decided by a handful of power-hungry individuals. For the first time in years, people felt safe in their own homes. One evening, Greg stopped by my house. He had an old notebook in his hands, worn at the edges from years of use. Inside were records, notes, and documentation he had quietly kept on the HOA's abuses over the years. He had never dared to challenge them before, knowing they would retaliate, but now that Francine and her allies were gone, he wanted to make sure their crimes were fully exposed. As I flipped through the pages, something jumped out at me. There was a specific note about a property dispute from years ago, one that involved Francine herself. According to Greg's notes, she had strong-armed a previous homeowner into selling their house by levying a series of escalating fines that were later found to be completely fabricated. The homeowner had been forced to sell at a loss, and the buyer of the property? None other than Francine's cousin. That was fraud. I took the notebook and added it to the growing pile of evidence being sent to the county prosecutors. If Francine thought she had already hit rock bottom, she was about to find out there was still further to fall. A few days later, I got a call from the county investigator handling the case. He wanted to meet in person. When I arrived at his office, he had a thick case file sitting on his desk. He opened it and slid a document across to me. It was an official notice of indictment. Francine and two of her closest allies from the former HOA board were being formally charged with fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes. The evidence was ironclad, and their days of abusing power were officially over. It didn't take long for the news to spread. The neighborhood was buzzing with talk of the charges, and for the first time in a long while, people weren't afraid to speak up. They shared their own stories of mistreatment, of fines that had never made sense, of threats and intimidation tactics used to keep them in line. Francine, once the self-proclaimed ruler of Oakridge Estates, was now facing the reality of her actions. Her smug confidence had evaporated, replaced with desperation. She tried to claim innocence, tried to paint herself as a victim of a witch hunt, but no one was buying it. The evidence was overwhelming, and the courts weren't about to let her off the hook. The last time I saw her, she was being escorted out of her house by officers, her face pale and tight with barely contained rage. She made a point not to look at me, but I could feel the weight of her anger. She had spent years wielding power over others, and now she was powerless. It was justice. With the last remnants of the old HOA leadership gone, the community continued to rebuild. People were no longer afraid to park in their own driveways, to decorate their homes the way they wanted, or to simply enjoy their property without fear of arbitrary punishment. The final blow came when the HOA, under its new leadership, voted to refund homeowners who had been unfairly fined over the years. The new board worked with local attorneys to determine which fines had been legitimate and which had been manufactured for profit. Those who had been wrongfully penalized received compensation, and the money that had once been funneled into secret accounts was now being used to improve the neighborhood instead of lining the pockets of corrupt board members. As for my camper, it stayed exactly where it belonged, and no one ever dared to challenge it again. The neighborhood had changed, and there was no going back. Oakridge Estates had once been a place of control, where a handful of people dictated how everyone else lived. But now, it was a community, a real one, where people worked together instead of living in fear. And Francine? She wouldn't be meddling in anyone's lives for a long, long time. The weeks that followed Francine's downfall were a whirlwind of change. With her and her cronies gone, the new HOA board wasted no time implementing the reforms we had pushed for. Transparency became the cornerstone of every decision, and homeowners were finally given the power to vote on issues that directly affected them. It was no longer a dictatorship, it was a real community. But the aftermath of the corruption ran deeper than anyone realized. The county's investigation into the HOA finances uncovered more than just fraudulent fines and illegal towing. They found evidence that previous board members had been siphoning money into shell accounts for years. Contractors who had supposedly done necessary maintenance on the neighborhood were either non-existent or linked to businesses owned by Francine's relatives. When the final audit was completed, the missing funds totaled over $200,000. That discovery led to a second wave of legal action. The county prosecutor filed additional charges against Francine and 3 former board members, escalating their crimes from simple fraud to felony embezzlement. The weight of the evidence was so overwhelming that 2 of them took plea deals immediately, agreeing to testify against Francine in exchange for reduced sentences. Francine, however, refused to accept reality. Despite being under house arrest while awaiting trial, she still clung to the belief that she could somehow worm her way out of the mess she had created. Her attorney tried to argue that everything had been a misunderstanding, that she had simply been misguided in her management of the HOA. But no one was buying it. The evidence was too damning, and the homeowners who had suffered under her rule weren't about to let her escape justice. Meanwhile, the towing company that had illegally taken my camper was dealt the final blow. Their state license was officially revoked, and the owner was hit with a massive lawsuit from multiple residents who had been victimized by their shady operations. Without the ability to operate legally, the business collapsed. Their lot was seized, their assets liquidated, and within a month, the building that once housed their corrupt enterprise was nothing more than an empty shell with a foreclosure sign out front. With the worst of the corruption purged, Oakridge Estates finally became the community it was always meant to be. The oppressive atmosphere that had lingered for years was gone, replaced with a sense of unity and trust. People who had once lived in fear of the HOA's ridiculous rules now worked together to improve the neighborhood without unnecessary interference. One evening, Greg invited me to a gathering at his house. Dozens of neighbors showed up, bringing food and drinks, celebrating the victory over the tyranny that had ruled for so long. Laughter and conversation filled the air, a stark contrast to the tension that had once gripped the community. As I stood in Greg's backyard, watching families relax and enjoy themselves, I realized just how much had changed. What had started with an illegal tow had led to the complete dismantling of a corrupt system. The people had taken back their power, and there was no going back. Greg approached me, handing me a cold drink. He didn't need to say anything, his expression said it all. Gratitude, relief, a sense of peace that had been missing for far too long. The neighborhood was finally free. And Francine? She was looking at a long, long time behind bars.